Johnny had finished his monologue. He turned to the audience. A man stood up in the back row and said, "Mr. Carson, you don't know me, but—" And Johnny's voice disappeared. It was March 1982. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Studio 6B in Burbank. Another Thursday night. Another packed audience. Another episode in a long chain of episodes that had made Johnny Carson the undisputed king of late-night television. The monologue had gone well. Good jokes about the economy, a bit about Reagan, something about California weather that got a big laugh. Johnny was in his element, relaxed, charming, that trademark smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Ed McMahon was chuckling beside him. Doc Severinson's band was ready for the transition music. Everything was routine. Everything was normal. Johnny turned toward the audience to do his usual banter before bringing out the first guest. "So how's everyone doing tonight? Anyone here from out of town?" Hands went up scattered throughout the audience. Johnny pointed to a few people, made some quick jokes, got some laughs. Standard audience interaction. He did this every night. Then a man in the third row stood up. Middle-aged, maybe 55. Simple button-down shirt. Thinning gray hair. The kind of ordinary-looking person who filled studio audiences every night, tourists and retirees and people who'd won radio contest tickets. "Mr. Carson," the man said, his voice carrying clearly in the studio's silence. "You don't know me, but I need to tell you something." Johnny smiled, expecting this to be a setup for a joke or maybe someone asking for an autograph. "Well, we're on live television, so make it quick," he said with practiced timing. The audience laughed. But the man didn't laugh. His hands were clasped together tightly. His face showed no humor. Just intensity. Just need. "My name is Robert Caldwell," the man said. "And 23 years ago, you saved my son's life." Johnny's smile froze. His hand, which had been gesturing casually, stopped midair. The studio went completely silent. Carson stopped mid-sentence. The entire studio froze. Ed McMahon straightened in his chair. Doc Severinson lowered the sheet music he'd been looking at. The cameras stayed locked on Johnny, who stood motionless behind his desk, staring at the man in the third row. "I'm sorry." Johnny's voice was quiet, uncertain. A tone his audience almost never heard from him. Robert Caldwell's eyes were filling with tears. 1959, you were doing a local show in Nebraska. My son David was 7 years old. He had leukemia. The doctors said he had maybe 3 months to live. Johnny's jaw tightened. His hand gripped the edge of his desk. My wife and we were broken, Robert continued, his voice cracking. We didn't know how to tell David. He was so young. He loved television. He loved watching you on that local show every afternoon. It was the only time he'd smiled during those last weeks. The audience was completely still. 300 people barely breathing. The control room had gone silent. Director Bobby Quinn's hand hovered over the commercial break button, but he didn't press it. Something told him not to interrupt. We wrote you a letter, Robert said. We didn't expect anything. We wanted you to know that you made our son happy in his final days. That's all. Just thank you. Johnny closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were glistening. But you didn't just read the letter. Robert continued. You showed up. At the hospital. On a Saturday. You weren't being paid. There were no cameras. You just came. The memories were flooding back now. Johnny could see it. That hospital room in Omaha, the small boy in the bed too big for him, the parents standing against the wall trying not to cry, the smell of antiseptic and the sound of machines. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who Johnny Carson was in 1959. He wasn't the Johnny Carson yet. He was a local television host in Nebraska making barely enough money to support his own family. He did an afternoon variety show. Skits, interviews, The kind of low-budget local programming that filled airwaves before cable television existed. He got letters from viewers sometimes. Most he never saw. His tiny production staff handled them. But this one letter had somehow made it to his desk. Maybe because it was handwritten on hospital stationery. Maybe because of what it said. Dear Mr. Carson. Our son David is dying. He has leukemia. The doctors say maybe 3 months. He's 7 years old. He doesn't understand why he's sick or why he has to stay in the hospital. But every day at 4 p.m., when your show comes on the hospital TV, he smiles. For 30 minutes he forgets about being sick. You make him laugh. We wanted you to know that. Whatever happens, you gave our little boy some happiness at the end. Thank you. Robert and Margaret Caldwell. Johnny had read that letter 3 times. Then he'd folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. That Saturday, his only day off, he'd driven to St. Joseph Hospital in Omaha instead of playing golf with his friends like he'd planned. He'd asked at the nurse's station for David Caldwell's room. The nurse had looked confused. Are you family? No, Johnny had said. I'm from the television show he watches. His parents wrote me. I just wanted to say hello. The nurse had stared at him for a long moment, then quietly given him the room number. Johnny had walked down that hallway carrying a small bag of things he'd grabbed from the station, some funny props from his show, a signed photo, a stuffed animal someone had sent as fan mail. Useless things. But he hadn't known what else to bring a dying 7-year-old. He knocked softly on the door. A woman's voice had said, "Come in." Robert and Margaret Caldwell had been sitting beside their son's bed. David was asleep, his small chest rising and falling with labored breaths, and 4 running into his thin arm. The parents had looked up at Johnny with expressions of complete confusion. I'm Johnny Carson, he'd said quietly. From the TV show. You wrote me a letter. Margaret Caldwell's hand had flown to her mouth. Robert had stood up slowly, disbelief written across his face. I hope it's okay that I came. Johnny had continued. I wanted to meet David. They'd woken their son gently. David had opened his eyes, seen Johnny standing there in his hospital room, and his face had transformed. You're the TV man, he'd said in a small, tired voice. Johnny had spent 2 hours in that room. He'd done magic tricks with the props he'd brought. He'd told jokes. He'd let David try on his watch. He made the boy laugh, really laugh, the kind of laughter that made the machines beat faster and made his parents cry with joy and heartbreak mixed together. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. When Johnny had finally left, he'd hugged both parents. Margaret had whispered, You didn't have to do this. You'll never know what it meant. Yes, I will, Johnny had said. I have kids too. He'd driven home and never mentioned it to anyone. Not his wife. Not his co-workers. Not his friends. It was private. Personal. Not something you did for credit or publicity. 3 weeks later, he'd gotten a call at the station. David Caldwell had died. The funeral was on Thursday. Would Mr. Carson like to attend? Johnny had gone. He'd sat in the back of the church, wearing sunglasses, trying not to be recognized. He'd watched the small coffin being carried out. He'd seen Robert and Margaret Caldwell, destroyed, holding each other up, moving like ghosts. He'd left before anyone could see him crying. A month after that, Johnny had gotten the offer to move to Los Angeles. To do The Tonight Show. To become famous. His life had changed completely. The years had blurred together, thousands of episodes, millions of viewers, countless celebrity interviews. He'd forgotten about David Caldwell. Not intentionally. Not cruelly. Just forgotten, the way you forget most moments of your life when decades pile up on top of them. Until tonight. March 1982. When a man stood up in his studio audience and brought it all back. Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Johnny stepped out from behind his desk. Not the casual stepping out he did sometimes during the show. This was different. Deliberate. He walked to the edge of the stage, his eyes locked on Robert Caldwell. "Your son," Johnny said, his voice rough. "David. How long did he?" 3 weeks after you visited," Robert said, tears streaming down his face now. "You gave him the best day of his final month. He talked about it constantly. The TV man came to see me. The TV man did magic tricks. He died happy, Mr. Carson. Because of you." The audience was crying. Not scattered sniffles but open, collective sobbing. Ed McMahon had his hand over his mouth. Doc Severinsen was wiping his eyes with his sleeve. Johnny looked down at his desk, at the blue cue cards scattered across it. Cards with jokes written on them. Prepared lines. Scripted banter. None of it mattered anymore. He looked back at Robert Caldwell. "Why are you here tonight? Why now, after all these years?" Robert took a shaky breath. "Because I've been trying to find you for 23 years. To say thank you properly. But you were always Johnny Carson, and I was nobody. I could never get through. Then last week, my wife Margaret, David's mother, she died. Cancer. And with her last words, she made me promise. She said, 'Find Johnny. Tell him what he did mattered. Tell him David died knowing someone cared.'" Johnny's composure shattered completely. Tears ran down his face. Johnny Carson, who never cried on camera, who maintained perfect professional distance, who kept his emotions locked away behind that practiced smile. He motioned to Robert. "Come here. Please." The audience parted as Robert Caldwell made his way down from the third row, stumbling slightly, other audience members reaching out to steady him. He walked to the stage. Johnny came down the steps to meet him. They stood face to face. This stranger, and this icon. This grieving father and this man who'd forgotten but was now remembering everything. "I'm so sorry about your wife," Johnny said quietly. "She loved you for what you did," Robert said. "We both did. You didn't know us. You didn't know us anything. But you showed up." But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. Johnny reached into his jacket pocket. His hand fumbled for a moment, then pulled out his wallet. From the wallet, he withdrew a small, worn piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully. It was the letter. The original letter from 1959. Robert and Margaret Caldwell's handwriting. Hospital stationery. Creased from 23 years of being carried. "I never forgot," Johnny said, his voice breaking. "I told myself I did. But I kept this. I've carried it in my wallet since the day I got it. I've carried it through every show, every episode, every year. Because it reminded me why I do this. Not for the laughs. Not for the ratings. For moments like the one I had with your son." Robert Caldwell stared at the letter he and his dying wife had written in desperation 2 decades ago, now worn and faded but preserved by a man they thought had forgotten them. Johnny handed it to Robert. "This belongs to you now. To David's memory. I want you to have it." Robert took the letter with trembling hands. He read his own handwriting from 23 years ago, words written in a hospital while his son slept in the next room. He collapsed into Johnny's arms, sobbing. Johnny held him. The king of late-night television, the man who interviewed presidents and movie stars, stood on his stage holding a grieving stranger while 300 people and millions watching at home witnessed something that transcended entertainment. The audience stood, applauding through tears. Not the excited applause of entertainment, but the reverent applause of people witnessing grace. Johnny pulled back, his hands on Robert's shoulders. "Your son mattered. Your wife mattered. And you showing up tonight, telling me this, it matters more than you'll ever know." Robert nodded, unable to speak, clutching the letter to his chest. Johnny turned to the camera. His face was tear-stained, his voice raw. "We'll be right back," he said simply. The show went to commercial. But Johnny didn't move. He stayed with Robert, talking quietly, while the audience remained standing in silence. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the show, Johnny had the hospital letter professionally preserved. He kept it in a frame on his desk at home for the rest of his life. Beside it, he placed a photo that Robert gave him that night, 7-year-old David Caldwell smiling in his hospital bed. When Johnny Carson died in 2005, that frame was found among his most precious possessions. His family donated it to the Smithsonian. David Caldwell's smile still reminds us, sometimes the smallest acts of kindness echo across decades.